It was supposed to be the happiest day of Chief Oladipo's life, but instead it began with the kind of omen that makes even the bravest heart tremble, because on the stormy night before his daughter's wedding, a scream tore through the quiet corridors of his sprawling Lagos mansion, the kind of scream that carried both terror and disbelief. And though the guests would never know, it was not the sound of joy, but the cry of someone who had glimpsed what should never have been seen. For Adesewa, his only daughter, the pride of his empire, the flawless jewel every man dreamed of marrying, was hiding a secret so dark that not even her closest friends could have imagined it. And yet, here she was, trembling, alone in her chambers, her body contorting under the glow of the moon, her silk nightgown tearing at the seams as scales shimmered faintly beneath her skin. And in that instant, the story began, not with celebration, but with a curse that had been festering long before her birth. To the world outside the mansion gates, Adesewa was the definition of perfection, tall, elegant, with a smile that could disarm even the harshest critic, and the daughter of a man whose wealth and influence stretched from Lagos to Abuja and beyond. But inside those gates, where whispers were silenced and servants were dismissed without question, she was a young woman imprisoned by a legacy of deceit. Her father had built his empire on an oath sealed in the river at midnight, when years ago he had knelt before the Marine Queen, a serpent goddess whose beauty was as terrifying as her power. And in exchange for riches beyond measure, he had pledged not his life, but his unborn child, the daughter who would one day be born neither fully human nor beast, cursed to carry the covenant in her very blood. And so, while the city admired her as a symbol of grace, every night her chamber doors were bolted shut and guards were posted to ensure that no one would hear the hiss of scales dragging across marble floors. That was the backstory buried in silence. But fate has a way of dragging secrets into the light, and the inciting incident arrived when Chief Oladipo announced her engagement to Tunde, a wealthy young man from another powerful family, declaring to the press that the union would be the wedding of the decade, the merging of two dynasties, the sealing of an empire. But what he did not say was that the covenant with the Marine Queen demanded fulfillment, and that this wedding night would not be one of love, but of unveiling. Adesewa had tried to warn her father, whispering late at night, "What if he finds out? What if he sees me as I truly am?" But Chief Oladipo silenced her with a cold hand on her shoulder, reminding her that their power, their wealth, their status depended on the covenant, and that the ritual demanded she conceal her fear until the night came, for the covenant could not be broken without blood. Still, the tension built like a storm cloud. Servants whispered of strange sounds from her chambers, of mirrors that cracked by themselves, of clothes shredded without touch, and one maid swore she had seen Adesewa's eyes glow emerald in the dark. But by morning, that maid was gone, dismissed without explanation, and the rest of the staff learned quickly that curiosity was dangerous in that house. As the wedding approached, the city erupted with excitement. Radio stations chattered endlessly, bloggers posted her photos, and newspapers described her as the most desirable bride in all of Nigeria. But no one asked why the bride never stayed long in crowds, why she hardly ate in public, or why her touch, though delicate, was always icy cold. Even Tunde, blind with love, ignored the warning signs. He saw only beauty where others might have glimpsed something strange. And when Adesewa smiled at him across the engagement party, he believed he had found the perfect wife, unaware that every night she curled in the shadows of her room with a serpent's tail where her legs should have been. Here the first twist took root, for what looked like a blessing to the world, a grand marriage, a merging of empires, was in truth the final snare tightening around her throat. And though Adesewa's heart longed for freedom, for a chance to be just a woman and not a creature bound by an ancient covenant,
she knew that the Marine Queen's voice would haunt her until the wedding night, whispering, "The covenant must be fulfilled." And deep down she feared that when the veil was lifted, the truth of who she was would not only destroy her marriage, but ignite a scandal that could tear apart her father's empire. And so, on that stormy Sunday morning, as the choir rehearsed hymns in the cathedral and the decorators draped the mansion with silk, Adesewa sat silently at her vanity, staring into her reflection, watching her pupils narrow into slits before returning to normal, her heart pounding with dread. And she wondered not if the secret would be revealed, but when.
The morning sun rose brightly over Lagos, but inside Chief Oladipo's mansion, the atmosphere carried an invisible weight. For while guests marveled at the beauty of the decorations and the glamour of the preparations, the servants moved with unease, whispering of strange happenings in the bridal chambers that none dared to question. And though Adesewa greeted visitors with the calm smile of a perfect bride, her nights told another story. Nights where her bones cracked and shifted, her legs melted into scales, and the walls of her room echoed with the hiss of something not human, something ancient. And every morning she would rise with trembling hands, covering her body with silk and jewels as if nothing had happened. But the truth gnawed at her like fire in her chest. The backstory of this fear lay in her father's greed, for Chief Oladipo's empire had not been built by hard work alone, but through a midnight covenant with the Marine Queen at the riverbank, where he had promised his unborn child as an offering for boundless riches. And though the covenant had granted him wealth, power, and the loyalty of the mighty, it had condemned his daughter to a life she never chose, a life that demanded her secret remain buried until the night when the covenant would claim its due. The warning signs were everywhere, mirrors that shattered in her presence, maids who disappeared after seeing too much, and even Tunde himself at once flinched when her eyes caught the light and gleamed unnaturally green. But love is a stubborn blindfold, and he brushed off the unease with laughter, convinced that every wedding brought nerves, that his bride was simply anxious, never once imagining that the woman he adored carried the blood of a serpent in her veins. The rising tension grew as the city itself prepared for the wedding of the decade, for no expense was spared. Chefs from Paris flew in, tailors from Milan adjusted gowns, and politicians polished speeches. But behind the glamour, Adesewa felt herself drowning, trapped between her father's ambition and the whisper of the Marine Queen in her dreams, a whisper that grew louder each night, saying, "The covenant must be sealed on your wedding night, or you will perish." And though Adesewa prayed for mercy, she knew that the Marine Queen's promises were never empty, for the first twist of fate had already begun to weave its snare. Every step closer to the altar was a step closer to her unveiling. Every vow rehearsed was a chain binding her tighter to the covenant. The disaster escalated in whispers among the staff. Bisi, a maid who had once carried food to Adesewa's chambers, was found days later, her mind broken, mumbling incoherently about a snake and silk before she was whisked away and silenced. And the others who remained learned quickly to keep their eyes down, their tongues quiet, for to speak of what they saw meant ruin. But fear has a way of seeping into the air, and soon the mansion's halls felt haunted by an unspoken dread. The second major twist revealed itself in Adesewa's own reflection, for as she prepared for a rehearsal dinner, she looked into the mirror and saw not her flawless face, but the glowing eyes and scaled skin of the creature within. And though she smashed the mirror in panic, shards cutting her hands, her father burst into the room and hissed, "Control yourself! You cannot fail me now!" His voice cold as stone. And in that moment, she realized she was less a daughter than a pawn in his empire of deceit. The climax of this scene arrived when, during the grand rehearsal inside the cathedral, as Adesewa stood beside Tunde beneath the golden arches,
the choir's voices swelling, her vision blurred, and the hiss returned, louder than ever. And for a moment, her pupils narrowed into serpentine slits in front of everyone. Though most dismissed it as a trick of the light, Elizabeth, the journalist invited to cover the event, leaned forward, her pen pausing, her instinct screaming that something was dangerously wrong with this fairy tale bride. By the time the rehearsal ended and the guests filed out, Adesewa sat silently in the back of the limousine, her hands trembling beneath her veil, her heart torn between terror and resignation. And though the world celebrated her as a symbol of grace and fortune, she knew in her soul that she was walking willingly into a night that would strip away the mask forever. And as the limousine rolled through the cheering streets, she whispered to herself, unheard by anyone else, "When the night comes, they will know."
The week of the wedding arrived like a storm cloaked in silk, with the Oladipo mansion becoming a palace of lights, gold, and music. Yet beneath the glamour, the air thickened with dread. For while journalists called it the wedding of the century, and socialites paraded in and out with gossip on their tongues, the servants who lived within those walls whispered of omens too dark to ignore. And though Adesewa stood smiling beside Tunde during interviews and public appearances, inside her heart a war raged, because each night her transformation grew more violent, each hiss more desperate, each dream more haunted by the Marine Queen's voice, commanding her to remember that the covenant would be sealed only when she surrendered herself fully on the wedding night. The backstory that no guest could see was that Chief Oladipo had spared no cost to protect the illusion of perfection. Designers from Paris flew in with a gown threaded with diamonds. Chefs from Italy brought recipes no common tongue could pronounce. And security guards patrolled every corner, not only against intruders, but against any servant bold enough to expose the family's secret. For the chief knew that wealth meant nothing if the truth slipped into the wrong ears. But the inciting incident of this scene began when Elizabeth, the sharp-eyed journalist, managed to bribe a dismissed maid named Funmi, who whispered in fear that the bride's room was cursed, that she once seen her mistress's reflection slither in the mirror with scales where skin should be. And though Elizabeth shivered at the tale, her instincts told her to dig deeper, for where there is smoke, fire cannot be far. And she began watching Adesewa more closely, noting how her hands shook when holding Tunde's, how she sipped only water at banquets, how she avoided light as though the brightness might expose her. The rising tension grew when Tunde himself, though blinded by love, started to sense something unusual. During a quiet evening in the garden, as he held Adesewa close, he felt her body shiver unnaturally, cold as stone, and when he pulled back to ask if she was all right, her eyes glowed faintly green before dimming again, but she forced a smile and whispered, "It's nothing, just nerves," and he kissed her forehead, ignoring the voice in his mind that whispered otherwise, for love is a stubborn master that turns fear into excuses. The first major twist came during the traditional engagement ceremony, where the families exchanged gifts under a canopy of drummers and dancers. And as Adesewa sat beside her fiancé, one of the elders suddenly fell into a trance, his eyes rolling back as he muttered, "The serpent watches, the serpent waits," his voice trembling before he collapsed to the floor. The guests screamed, rushing to help, but the chief quickly dismissed it as drunkenness, paying the man's family handsomely to silence the incident. Yet Elizabeth recorded every detail, her suspicion sharpening like a blade. The disaster escalated later that night when Adesewa, left alone in her chambers, broke down in sobs, clawing at her reflection in the mirror as her transformation forced itself upon her, scales glistening across her legs, her body twisting until she collapsed on the cold marble floor, whispering, "I cannot do this, I cannot." But from the shadows, the Marine Queen's voice thundered, "You have no choice, child of the covenant. Without me, you are nothing." Adesewa curled in despair, knowing that rebellion meant death, but obedience meant ruin. The second major twist arrived the following evening when, during the final rehearsal at the cathedral, as she stood in her gown under the glowing chandeliers, Elizabeth caught her staring blankly into space, lips moving as though whispering to an unseen presence. And though others clapped at her beauty, Elizabeth's pen did not stop, for she knew this bride was carrying something darker than anxiety. The climax of this scene built when, just as the rehearsal ended, the lights flickered, the choir gasped, and a serpent's hiss echoed faintly through the cathedral, so soft that only a few heard it, but enough for panic to ripple through the servants, who crossed themselves in fear, muttering, "This wedding is cursed." Adesewa forced a laugh, masking her terror, but her hands trembled beneath the lace. And when she finally returned to the mansion, she collapsed onto her bed, whispering into the darkness, "If this were you, would you still go through with the wedding, knowing the truth would destroy everything?" A question that even she did not know how to answer.
The wedding day dawned with a brilliance that seemed almost ironic, for while the streets of Lagos erupted in celebration and the cathedral bells rang across the city, the Oladipo mansion was wrapped in an unease so thick that even the servants could not shake it. And yet, to the thousands gathered, the day looked perfect. The bride of the century was about to be joined with her prince, the union of two dynasties that promised power, wealth, and endless prestige. But hidden beneath the shimmering gowns, diamond-studded veils, and towering floral arches was a secret that threatened to unravel it all. Adesewa, dressed in a gown imported from Paris and adorned with jewelry worth more than villages, stepped out of the limousine with a smile that dazzled the cameras. But inside her chest, her heart pounded like a trapped bird, because she knew this was the day the covenant would claim her in full. The backstory of her dread lay not only in her nightly transformations, but in the promise her father had repeated again and again. "Endure the wedding night, seal the covenant, and our family's fortune will last forever." Words that had never comforted her, but instead felt like a curse tightening around her throat. And as she walked down the aisle, her veil shielding her trembling eyes, she wondered if anyone in that crowd could sense that behind the beauty was a soul screaming for freedom. The inciting incident of this scene came when she locked eyes with Elizabeth, seated near the front with her notebook, the only one in the crowd who did not cheer blindly, but instead studied her with a gaze sharp as a blade. And in that instant, Adesewa felt exposed, as though the journalist could see the serpent lurking just beneath her skin, and she nearly stumbled before her father's hand steadied her and his whisper hissed in her ear, "Smile, the world is watching." The rising tension grew as the vows were exchanged, because each word felt like a chain linking her closer to doom. And when Tunde slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt the serpent blood inside her stir, scales itching to break through, though she clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palm, forcing herself to remain human for just a little longer. Then came the first major twist, the kiss, when Tunde lifted her veil and pressed his lips to hers, and though the crowd erupted in cheers, he shivered violently at the icy chill of her mouth, pulling back slightly as though startled, but the priest declared them man and wife, drowning his unease beneath the roar of applause, and Adesewa smiled through her veil of terror, whispering inwardly, "Forgive me, my love, for what you will see tonight." The disaster escalated at the reception, where hundreds danced, politicians toasted, and cameras flashed. Yet the bride touched no food, sipped no wine, and seemed to glide more than walk across the hall, her every movement graceful yet unnatural.
and several guests whispered that her pupils looked strange when caught by the lights, narrowing into slits before returning to normal, though each time her father silenced such talk with laughter and lavish distractions, throwing more champagne into glasses and demanding more music to drown the unease. The second major twist arrived when Elizabeth cornered one of the junior maids outside the hall, a trembling girl who whispered, "She is not what you think she is. The bride is cursed," before darting away in fear of being overheard. And Elizabeth, though shocked, now knew her instincts were correct. The bride's beauty was only a mask hiding something monstrous. The climax of the scene came as Adesewa and Tunde took to the dance floor, swaying under the golden chandeliers while cameras flashed. And in that moment, Elizabeth swore she saw it. The bride's eyes glowed faint green, and for the briefest second, scales shimmered beneath the silk of her gown as her feet twisted unnaturally before returning to normal. A sight so fleeting that others dismissed it as imagination. But Elizabeth's pen pressed harder against her notebook, her certainty unshakable. The millionaire's daughter was hiding something that could shatter the empire before the night was over. And so, as the reception wound down and the newlyweds prepared to leave for the bridal suite, the world cheered for a love story they believed was perfect, while Adesewa, her smile frozen in place, whispered silently to herself, "When darkness falls, they will know who I truly am."
The bridal suite glowed with a soft light of candles and rose petals scattered across silk sheets, a romantic paradise carefully prepared for the moment that was supposed to bind Adesewa and Tunde forever. Yet inside those walls, the truth could no longer be contained, and the weight of the covenant pressed down like chains of iron, for this was the night the Marine Queen had demanded her due. Tunde, still glowing from the cheers of the crowd and the endless praise of their guests, wrapped his arms around his bride with the innocence of a man in love, whispering, "At last, you are mine." But Adesewa froze in his embrace, her smile brittle, her body trembling with a fear she could no longer disguise. And though she wanted desperately to stay in his warmth, her blood boiled with the serpent curse, warning her that her time as human was running out. The backstory of this dread was etched in her soul. Every night since childhood, she had endured the transformation, watching in horror as her delicate legs twisted into scales and a tail coiled where her body should have been. But this night was different, for the covenant decreed that on her wedding night she would fully belong to the Marine Queen, her fate sealed forever. And though her father's voice echoed in her memory, "Do not resist, Adesewa, or you will doom us all," her heart screamed against it, longing for freedom, longing to be loved as a woman and not as a cursed creature. The inciting incident of this moment came when Tunde, sensing her trembling, cupped her face tenderly and whispered, "What is it, my love? You're safe with me." And for a heartbeat, she almost believed him, almost confessed the truth. But before the words could leave her lips, her body convulsed violently, her skin rippling as scales began to break through the silk gown, and with a cry, she collapsed onto the floor, clutching her chest as the transformation tore through her like fire. The rising tension erupted as Tunde stumbled back, eyes wide with horror, watching his bride writhe on the floor as her legs fused into a long serpent's tail that slapped against the marble with a sickening crack, her nails sharpening into claws, her pupils narrowing into glowing green slits. And yet tears streamed down her human face as she begged in a voice layered with sorrow, "Don't run, Tunde. Please, I never wanted this." The first major twist hit him like a storm. The woman he loved, the woman he had sworn vows to only hours ago, was no ordinary bride, but something monstrous. And though his heart wanted to cling to her, his body recoiled in terror, his mind screaming for escape. The disaster escalated as the suite filled with her anguished hisses, furniture crashing as she thrashed in torment, while Tunde clawed at the door, shouting for help.
but it had been locked from the outside, sealed by her father's command. For Chief Oladipo knew this moment would come and had ordered that no one disturb them, believing the covenant demanded silence and secrecy. The second major twist came when Adesewa, regaining some control, coiled her serpent tail around the legs of the bed and lifted her head to face him, her eyes glowing yet filled with pain, whispering, "If you leave me, I am lost forever. But if you stay, perhaps we can fight this curse." Her voice trembling with both venom and vulnerability. But Tunde's heart pounded too violently, his fear drowning the love he once carried. And though he shook his head in disbelief, he could not step forward. The climax of the scene exploded when Adesewa's sorrow turned into a scream that rattled the chandeliers, her serpent form surging with power as the Marine Queen's voice thundered through her. "You are mine, child of the covenant, and no mortal love will save you." Tunde collapsed against the wall, trembling, as the shadows in the room seemed to writhe with unseen serpents, and he realized he was trapped not only with his bride, but with an ancient force that had chosen her soul long before he had ever laid eyes on her. And so, as the candles flickered and the walls shook with her anguished cries, Tunde's love story twisted into a nightmare. And Adesewa, her tail coiled beneath her, wept bitterly, knowing that the secret was no longer hidden, and that from this night forward nothing in her life, or in the lives of those who loved her, would ever be the same.
By dawn, the whispers had already spread beyond the walls of the bridal suite, though no one outside truly knew what had happened, only that the groom had been seen fleeing half-dressed into the hotel corridor, his face pale, his eyes wild, muttering of things too terrible to name. And while Chief Oladipo's security men quickly silenced the staff and paid handsomely for their silence, rumors cannot be buried as easily as money. For soon the city began to buzz with talk that something unnatural had marred the most glamorous wedding of the decade. Inside the mansion, Adesewa sat trembling in her chamber, her serpent form hidden again beneath heavy robes, her eyes bloodshot from weeping, her body weak from the transformation that had come too violently, and her heart broken because the fear in Tunde's face had been sharper than any blade, confirming her greatest terror, that love could never overcome the curse she carried. The backstory that drove her despair was the cruel reminder that she had never been given a choice, that before she had even taken her first breath, her father had signed her fate away to the Marine Queen, binding her to a covenant that demanded not only her womb, but her very soul. And though she had tried for years to hide behind silk gowns and polite smiles, she now knew that the mask had shattered forever. The inciting incident of this chapter arrived when Elizabeth, the journalist who had been suspicious from the beginning, received a message from an anonymous staff member. A photograph of the bridal suite after the disaster, showing claw marks across the wall, shattered mirrors and faint green scales scattered on the floor. And though she shivered at the sight, her instincts screamed that this was the story of her career, a truth too explosive to ignore. The rising tension grew as Elizabeth began to dig into the past of Chief Oladipo, uncovering whispers of his midnight visits to the river, his inexplicable rise in wealth after those rituals, and the strange disappearances of staff who had worked in his mansion. And with each testimony she gathered, the picture became clearer. The empire of gold was built not on business, but on blood. And the bride who had been hailed as perfection was the living reminder of that dark bargain. The first major twist unfolded inside the Oladipo mansion itself, where Adesewa confronted her father, her eyes blazing with pain as she cried, "You sold me before I was even born. Do you call this love?" But Chief Oladipo only sighed, his voice cold, declaring, "Do you not see, child? Without this covenant we are nothing. Our name, our power, our fortune, it all dies if you defy her. You are not cursed, Adesewa, you are chosen." His words, meant to console, stabbed deeper than knives, for she realized then that to him she was not a daughter, but a vessel of the covenant.
The disaster escalated as Tunde's family demanded an annulment, their lawyers preparing to sever the union quietly, calling the bride bewitched. And though the Oladipos tried to bury the scandal with bribes, rumors flared hotter. Market women whispered that the bride had scales. Taxi drivers swore the groom had seen a snake in the bridal suite, and neighbors whispered of wailing cries that echoed from the mansion at night. The second major twist struck when, in the midst of her despair, Adesewa felt the Marine Queen's presence stronger than ever. A voice that thundered through her dreams and into her waking hours, hissing, "Do not seek freedom, child. You belong to me until the rivers run dry. Your womb is barren, your soul is mine, and if you dare resist, I will devour all you love." The climax of this scene built when Adesewa awoke screaming, scales shimmering across her body as her serpent tail burst forth again. But this time not in secret, for Elizabeth, having infiltrated the grounds, hid outside her window with a camera, recording everything, her breath ragged as she captured undeniable proof that the millionaire's daughter was not human. And as Elizabeth fled into the night with her evidence, her mind racing with equal parts terror and resolve, Adesewa collapsed onto the cold floor, her tears mingling with the hiss of her curse, whispering, "If the world sees me, they will not call me daughter. They will call me monster."
By the time the sun rose again, the whispers had become louder than the music of the wedding drums, spreading like wildfire across Lagos. Yet, within the Oladipo estate, there was only silence, a suffocating silence, heavy with shame, fear, and denial. For while Chief Oladipo worked feverishly to contain the scandal with bribes and threats, Adesewa lay in her chambers, broken, the echo of her groom's terrified eyes carved into her memory, a wound deeper than any serpent fang. And though her father told her sternly, "We will fix this, no one will believe lies without proof," she knew in her heart that the truth was already clawing its way into the right. The backstory of this torment ran deeper than just her failed wedding night. It was the culmination of years of lies stitched together by her father, years of hiding her nightly transformations, of silencing servants who had seen too much, of staging a perfect image of wealth and purity. But the cracks had now widened, and through them seeped the curse of the covenant that could no longer be hidden. The inciting incident that pushed this secret toward exposure was Elizabeth's determination, for after escaping the estate with her camera, she published fragments of her evidence anonymously online. Blurred photos of scales on silk sheets, claw marks across the walls of the bridal suite, and the trembling testimony of a maid who whispered of a snake in a wedding dress. And though skeptics laughed at first, the internet erupted, and soon radio stations and gossip blogs carried the story, calling it the curse of the millionaire's daughter. The rising tension exploded when Elizabeth herself became a target, shadowy men following her at night, threatening calls hissing down her phone lines, and once, as she walked home, she swore she saw glowing green eyes staring from the darkness before vanishing. Yet her fear only fueled her resolve, for she believed the truth, once fully revealed, could free not only Adesewa, but countless others ensnared by false prophets and secret covenants. The first major twist came when Adesewa, exhausted and desperate, managed to smuggle a note to Elizabeth through a sympathetic maid, the words trembling across the paper. "Meet me by the river at midnight. Help me, or we all perish." For the first time, she dared to rebel against her father's grip, daring to hope that perhaps the journalist could do what she herself could not. The disaster escalated as the Marine Queen's presence grew stronger with each passing night. Adesewa could no longer control her transformations, scales rippling even under daylight, her voice hissing words she did not mean. And in her dreams she was dragged beneath black waters where the queen towered over her, declaring, "You are mine, child. You will bear no heir. You will serve until your last breath." Each awakening left her weaker, her humanity slipping like sand through her fingers, and she realized that if she did nothing, the queen would consume her completely. The second major twist surged when her father discovered the note had been sent. Furious, he stormed into her chambers, his face twisted with rage, shouting, "You dare defy me? Do you know what this means? Without the covenant, we lose everything." But Adesewa, scales shimmering faintly beneath her tears, spat back words she had never dared before. "Then let it all be lost, father. I would rather die free than live as her slave." The climax of the scene came that very midnight, when Elizabeth, clutching her recorder and phone, crept to the river behind the mansion, her heart hammering with both fear and anticipation. And there in the mist, she saw Adesewa step from the shadows, cloaked and trembling, her beauty both human and inhuman under the moonlight. "You came," Adesewa whispered, her voice quivering with desperation. "I don't have much time." And before Elizabeth could respond, the river stirred violently, waves rising as a colossal figure emerged, half woman, half serpent, crowned with scales that shimmered like oil. The Marine Queen had arrived. Her voice thundered like 1,000 storms. "Adesewa, you dare betray me?" And in that instant, the truth stood unveiled, the covenant in flesh, and Elizabeth realized with horror that this story was not just about a millionaire's cursed daughter, but about an ancient power that had been hiding in plain sight, feeding on silence, fear, and blood.
The river churned violently under the midnight moon, its waters rising as though bowing to the presence of the Marine Queen, her towering form a grotesque blend of beauty and terror, scales glistening like polished obsidian, eyes glowing with a predatory hunger that froze the air. And as Elizabeth crouched in the reeds, clutching her camera, she realized that this was no myth, no rumor, but a living covenant that had ruled in shadows for generations, feeding on the greed of men like Chief Oladipo, who were willing to sell blood for gold. Adesewa fell to her knees at the riverbank, her serpent tail bursting through her gown, her face twisted with both fear and defiance, and she cried out, "I cannot live like this anymore. I will not be your slave." But the queen's laughter rolled like thunder, chilling the night. "You belong to me, child of the covenant. Without me, you are nothing. Without me, your father is nothing. Your womb is barren, your soul is bound. Do you think you can defy me now?" The backstory of this confrontation was written in every deal her father had struck, every servant silenced, every night Adesewa wept alone in her chambers, and now it had culminated in this moment, where truth and curse collided under the watching moon. The inciting incident that pushed the scene forward came when Elizabeth, trembling but resolute, raised her camera and snapped a photo, the flash cutting across the riverbank. The queen's head snapped toward her, hissing, "Mortal, you dare witness what is forbidden?" And waves exploded, dragging Elizabeth forward into the shallows. The rising tension grew as Adesewa screamed, coiling her serpent tail around the journalist, pulling her back from the water, her voice breaking, "No, leave her, she is innocent." For the first time, her defiance was not only for herself, but for another, a spark of humanity that the queen had not extinguished. The first major twist came when the queen hissed, "Then you will pay her price," and with a surge of power, struck Adesewa's chest with a glowing mark, burning her flesh as she writhed in agony, scales flashing violently, yet her eyes never left Adesewa, as though pleading for her to live even if she herself perished. The disaster escalated as the river erupted into chaos, the queen towering higher, waves slamming against the shore, serpents slithering from the depths to coil around the trees, and Adesewa, though weakened, wrapped her tail around the queen in a desperate attempt to hold her back, her voice echoing into the night.
The second major twist came when Chief Oladipo himself arrived, drawn by the noise, and stood at the edge of the river with terror carved into his face. For the first time, he saw the covenant in its raw fury, not as a bargain of wealth, but as a consuming curse. And when the queen turned her gaze to Oladipo, hissing, "This is the empire you built, Oladipo. This is the price you swore. Watch your daughter suffer for your greed." He fell to his knees, sobbing, his pride shattered. The climax erupted when Adesewa, her body glowing with the mark of the queen, summoned the last of her strength and screamed, "If I am cursed, then let me be cursed with choice." And with one final surge, she dragged both herself and the queen into the river's depths, water exploding as they vanished beneath the surface, leaving only silence and rippling moonlight. Elizabeth, gasping on the shore, clutched her camera, her tears mixing with the mist, while Chief Oladipo collapsed in the mud, his cries echoing into the night, knowing his empire of gold had been bought with the life of his only child. The resolution settled like ash. By morning the river was still, Adesewa gone, the queen unseen. But Elizabeth's photos and testimony spread like wildfire, exposing the covenant, the staged perfection, the dark power behind the wealth. Many wept, others raged, but all who read the story understood the lesson. Not every crown is a blessing, not every bride a fairy tale, and not every fortune is free of blood. And as Elizabeth ended her report, her voice trembling yet resolute, she told the world, no one knew the millionaire's daughter was a serpent until her wedding night, but perhaps the greater serpent was the greed that bound her soul before she was even born.
And so the night that was meant to seal a love story instead revealed a nightmare that had been hiding for decades. No one knew the millionaire's daughter was a serpent until her wedding night. But perhaps the real curse was not her scales, but the greed that had bound her before she was even born. If you were in Tunde's place, would you have stayed or would you have run? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another chilling story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next tale.